Hello everyone. So I just want to create a short video to talk a little bit about the process of organizing memories. And whenever we talk about organizing memories, one of the main things that we're going to be talking about is the idea of a memory network. And so this memory network comes from a group of cognitive psychologists who call themselves the connectionists. And basically, they view the way that all cognitive processes are set up is they're set up in a very connected way. And probably their idea of a memory network is the most direct example of what they view cognitive processes as being connectionistic. But on the right-hand side of the screen, what we have here is we have a representation of what a connectionist view of memory might look like. And basically, this shouldn't be that unfamiliar, especially as the world gets more hip to infographics and whatnot. This is something that most of you are probably familiar with, and the different pieces of information that are established in here, how they interrelate to each other. But let's say, take for example, this particular node. And so on this particular node, we have the idea of a brain. And so according to the connectionists, there are going to be a number of things that are associated with this idea or memories associated with the brain. There's going to be things such as mind and intelligence that are going to be associated with it, but also things like thinking, the ability to be smart, and the brain is in the head. Or if we were to just choose another node at random. In this case, we have a node for memories related to man, and then something that's going to be really strongly associated with this are ideas or memories associated with woman, but also because there's the idea of the man in the moon, the idea of moon might be closely associated with this. Also, yeah, there are other things like muscle and strong that may be associated with the concept of man. And so the connectionist view of memory really is this very intertangled web of memories. And so here, this is just a small portion of the network, right? This network, we're going to have a gigantic network with a bunch of interconnections based on how we might actually store memory. But in this particular case, this is just a subset to kind of get across the idea. Now, each of these gray circles basically represents a node, and these are just memory representations about some particular topic. So memory associations tied to bed, or memory associations tied to lady, or brain. Okay, and so each of the nodes basically just represents memory for a particular idea or concept. Now, the black lines that connect these are going to be what are called associative links or associations. And basically, these are ideas that are going to be directly connected with whatever the node is. So we've already talked about this in brain, but in the case of brain, we might think of things like intelligence, smart, or brain tumors are relatively common, so there may be connections between the brain and tumor. So the idea of the associative links is basically what are the connections to a particular node, or how are different concepts or nodes interrelated to each other. Now, one of the ways that this is demonstrated on the map, or one of the things that we can talk about, is things being either very closely associated or very distantly associated with the concept. Now, the way that that's represented in this particular map is by the thickness of the line. And so when we talk about man and woman, and we see that this is a really, really thick line, what this is telling us is this is a very close association. These two ideas are so similar and related to each other that they're paired very, very closely to each other. So often if we were to think about man, chances are good we're also going to think about woman. Or similarly, if we think about the skull, there's a close association with head, and so if we think about either skull or head, we're going to think of the other node that's very closely associated with it. And so thickness of the line is one way to demonstrate either how strong or weakly things are associated with each other. So for example, if we look at a more thin line, in this particular case, if we look at the connection between man and the moon, yeah, there's a connection most of us know, but that's probably a very distant connection. And most people are not going to think of the man on the moon anytime they hear the word man. And so that's going to be represented by a much thinner line here. Sorry, a much thinner line here because they're not very closely associated with each other. Now, that's one way that we can represent the association between different nodes. The other way that you may have seen is basically the distance between nodes. And so things that are very closely associated are going to be tucked. And so I unfortunately don't have a diagram for this, although when we do our own example, you'll see a little bit of this. But the distance of the lines between the different nodes can also represent how closely associated they are. So if the distance between the lines is very, very small, then chances are good they're going to be closely associated concepts, ideas, or memories. And if they're much longer lines, then they're going to be more distantly related to each other, or more distantly associated with each other. So hopefully that makes sense as far as what we mean when we talk about the nodes and the associative links or the associations between different concepts. Now the reason I set this up is because I want to use a light bulb analogy. And so basically why the distance matters of whether things are strongly or weakly associated with each other is because I want to set up the idea of a net light bulb analogy. And so I'll go into more detail of this in the next slide. But think about what ends up happening. So let's say you have one light bulb in your room and you turn that light bulb on. What ends up happening with that light? And chances are pretty good that what's going to happen are things that are directly under that light are going to be receiving a lot of light. However, as we spread out more into the room, what you're going to notice is those objects are going to get less light. And I want you to keep this idea in mind as we start talking about memory network and how activation of one of the nodes is going to have an effect on the nodes that surround it. And basically, it's going to be the same as the light bulb analogy that I just set up here, where we have basically, if we activate the concept of brain, things that are going to be more closely associated with it are also going to become very active. So things like head and think are going to become activated whenever we see brain, although things that are more distantly related, such as intelligence or mind, may not be as strongly activated. So hold on to that idea as we go through the next slide and talk a little bit about that. But as you're thinking about it, think about this light bulb analogy that I gave you, where if a light bulb's pointing at something, things that are directly under the light bulb are going to get a lot of activation, whereas as we move out from the center of the light, it's going to get a lot less lightning or a lot less activation. The similar thing's going to happen in our memory network. Now, whenever we activate a node in our memory network, there's going to be a process that's called spreading activation. And so activation is basically whenever a node is receiving some sort of a strong input, you can think of it as firing, right? So that node becomes active. Now, the other concept we need to set up is this idea of a response threshold. And this response threshold is the point at which a node fires. And so this is where we come back to what I was trying to say with the light bulb analogy. In the case of spreading activation, and actually let's head back a little bit here. But in the case of spreading activation, since there's a very close association between man and woman, anytime that man is activated in the network, there's going to be spreading activation. And because it's so closely associated with woman, chances are really good that this person is not only going to have man pop up in their memory, but also this close association with woman. However, things that are more distantly related, such as moon, chances are good that it's going to there's going to be a threshold activation and it's not going to become as active. So people may quickly associate women whenever, or think of women whenever they think of man, but they're probably not going to think about the man on the moon. So that's what we're talking about whenever we're talking about this memory network. Now, one of the things that I should say about spreading activation is, and this goes back to the idea of a response threshold, is that there's going to be some point. So anytime that we talk about a threshold, we're basically saying that there's some point at which activation isn't going to occur. So we talked about this a little bit when we talked about inhibition and excitation for cells firing whenever we're reviewing how neurons work. We also could think of the goal line in football as being some sort of a threshold, and you have to be able to pass that threshold in order to receive a point. Even if you get right up to the tippy edge of that threshold, you're not going to receive a point or a touchdown in football. And a similar thing is going to happen here. So when we talk about spreading activation, like I said, we could basically think of shining a spotlight on this concept of a brain. And that light's going to closely hit things like head and think. Now, one of the questions that comes up is how likely is it that it's going to activate things that are more distantly related, such as intelligence or thought? And that's where the response threshold or the activation threshold comes into play here. If that threshold is really, really high, then chances are good it's going to activate those nodes. If it's not really high, then chances are good that it's not going to activate those. And the reason that we talk about this is because there has to be some limit at which the network isn't going to be activated, right? So you don't want that light to spread too far. Instead, what you want to do is you just want very clearly associated things that are associated with memory to be highlighted and to be activated whenever somebody is thinking about a particular memory or concept. And that's why we talk about this threshold, is because at some point that has to peter out, or the light has to become so not well lit that it's not going to activate the entire network. So hopefully that makes sense. I feel like my explanation here could use a little work, so definitely use the discussion board if I need to kind of come back and explain this. For some reason, it's not coming out as well as it typically does. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift gears here and actually bring up a separate video within this video where we make our own web, and hopefully that will also clarify some of these issues. But like I said, if you do have any questions about spreading activation, please let me know. I'm happy to either re-record a video or try to explain it in a better manner. Hello everyone. So we're going to take a section out of the slideshow and do a demonstration that I typically, when I'm teaching this class face-to-face, we actually just do this on the chalkboard. But what I'm going to try and do is recreate that experience to demonstrate how a memory network works just by doing it through PowerPoint in a manner similar to how I might do it if we're in the classroom and I was doing this on the chalkboard. But let's say, for example, that we start off talking about me. And so especially since you have me for an online class, there are probably some things that you closely associate with me. One of them may be cats, because I have a love for cats, and a lot of times the lectures that I'm recording are interrupted by my cats. The other thing that you probably notice, especially since you have to listen to me in videos talking basically to a computer screen without anybody present, there's a lot of uhs and okays, and so maybe you closely associate these two things with me in your memory network. Now, there might be some other things, especially if you've had me for face-to-face classes before, or you've heard of my face-to-face classes, but there's some other things that you might not connect with me as closely because you haven't had me in face-to-face classes. But when I do this, these are usually things that come up as being very closely associated with me. But I love coffee. Anytime that I'm in the classroom, I have a cup of coffee with me. And if you see me wandering around the halls, chances are good that I have a cup of coffee. And so coffee would also be something that may be closely associated with me in your memory network. Even if you've never had me as a professor, maybe you've seen me walking around the hallways with my coffee. The other thing that's usually closely associated with me, and doesn't happen as much in the online environment because it's awkward to make jokes and puns just to yourself sitting in your home, but I love to use puns, and so I use puns a ton. My classrooms are filled with pun jokes, and so you may not have had me again as a professor, but maybe you know that I have a love of puns, or you've heard me in the hallway punning around with somebody. But here, what I'm trying to do is to establish a memory network node for myself, and the memory network node that you may have about me. Now, let's take another professor in the department. So maybe you've had Dr. Broadbent either in online or face-to-face courses. And one of the things that whenever I do this, and I use Dr. Broadbent as an example that gets closely associated with her, is neuroscience, because her background and her specialty is in the field of neuroscience. And also a lot of students talk about her having a British accent. Now, since people have had Dr. Broadbent in a range of either online or face-to-face, especially those that have had her face-to-face, know that she loves to give candy out in her class. And so a lot of times if people answer questions, she'll give candy out. And so that's another thing that tends to be associated with Dr. Broadbent because of people's experiences with her online where she can't give out candy. Maybe that's not as closely associated with her. Now let's take a third faculty member, Dr. Horgan. And again, people are going to have a range of experiences. You may or may not have had Dr. Horgan as a professor. You may have had him either face-to-face or online. And I've rarely never seen any of his online classes, so I don't know what he does in the online environment, but just knowing him, chances are pretty good that he talks a lot about his research in nonverbal communication, and so I'm sure that shows itself in its classes. And in fact, he teaches a special class specifically on that topic in the department. Also, I don't know if he makes as many jokes as he does face to face, but he usually, when I do this exercise, people associate dad jokes with Dr. Horgan. He makes a lot of dad jokes in class. I assume that he still does that on the online environment. So maybe it's not as closely connected to Dr. Horgan as his nonverbal research, but most people, at least in their memory network, will associate dad jokes with Dr. Horgan. So here I have individual nodes for faculty members within the psych department in UM Flint. And one of the things that you may notice is that there is a connection between all of us. While we each have our own little separate subnodes that people think about whenever they think about us, there's also the commonality here where we're all psych faculty. And so we're all connected in a memory network there. And you could easily attach other faculty members within the psych department to that. And then also, just both as being members of the psych faculty, we're also all psychologists, right? And so there's interconnections where potentially, if you think about psychologists that you've had interactions with throughout your lifetime, there may be a range of other ones, but right there would also be activation for the three different faculty members that I talk about here. And so the point of this exercise, even though there's really not too much interaction in the exercise, is to highlight both how we might develop our own memory network, in this case a very limited memory network, about 3 faculty members in the psych department at UM Flint, but how we might develop our own memory network and what these might look like, of how we can talk about the distance between the connections, or the connection between the nodes, and how some nodes are going to be more closely related and some are going to be more distantly related. And it actually kind of works out nicely that there's a range of experiences of having faculty online and face-to-face, and how things might differ between them, because that really is going to have an effect on either how closely or how far your connection to that node or experience of that person, or the connection between the node and memory, is going to have on their on your particular network. So hopefully that helps clarify a little bit about the connectionist models of memory. But if you have any questions, definitely reach out. I'm happy to help.